Well, I'm from Lone Rock, and I don't know if I can hold a candle. Oh, hold a candle to the previous speaker, but he's a good friend, so I won't try. I'll give you my version. And our history begins with the Wisconsin River. And it was a natural waterway or way to travel for the Native Americans, the missionaries, fur traders, raftsmen, and the military. And there is an interesting story about the military. I was told, or I read, that a military boat was going from Prairie du Chien to Green Bay and Portage with the wages, the payroll. And there was a rock slide, and it buried the boat and the people and the money, and they never found them except when they worked on the last bridge. They found a big timber that probably was from that ship. But people doubted the truth of that, but that may have verified it. So the Wisconsin River was used to get from Green Bay, Portage, and Sauk City to Prairie du Chien or back the other way, and there were forts in those areas. Travelers all noticed the rocky bluffs along the way. And on the north side of the river was a tall outcropping of sandstone that rose up above the others. They used this as a landmark, and they referred to it as the Lone Rock, and thus we were named. The rock was used in the foundations of homes in the village, the Congregational Church, and it was also used as fill for the railroad bridge. What's left of it is on the west side of Highway 130 and just before Long Lake and the first bridge. Now, bridges were necessary in this area. Or people had to either walk across ice in the wintertime, or some people walked over the railroad bridge, and there was a ferry. It cost you 5 cents to ride the ferry. The Culver family ran the ferry from 1896, until 1896. And then Buena Vista and Lone Rock built a toll bridge, and the Culvers became the toll tenders, and the toll was 25 cents. There were a series of bridges built by Clyde and Lone Rock, and we have to remember that the river wasn't as wide as it is now. It was about 200 feet wide, so they didn't have to build many spans like they do today, but it could be a shorter bridge. And the river was very deep and very swift, and there were rock cliffs all along the sides. And there were twists and turns to navigate, and one of those turns was called the Devil's Elbow. And those canoes and boats and so forth really had to look out for that. In 1891, they formed the Lone Rock Bridge Company. I guess maybe Clyde got tired of paying for a bridge too or something, but, and they had $500 worth of notes. The DOT finally took over in 1942, and they built the last bridge that we see today. The railroad came in 1856. as Steve said. And the sites along the railroad were 6 to 7 miles apart. And that was because they used wood for their fuel, and they could get that far with one load of fuel. The Lone Rock became the shipping center for the county, and they had a stockyard there and shipped all kinds of cattle, sheep, pigs, so forth, to eastern markets. And they also shipped loads of wheat and ties. At that time, the young men in town, or boys probably, found another use for that stockyard. There were a lot of gates, and they made up games and swung the gates and climbed over everything. And once in a while, there were some cattle that were left there, and they didn't mind chasing them around either. They also shipped regular supplies for businessmen. And in 1870, the narrow gauge line from Lone Rock to Richland Center was started. And in 1876, the first load of passengers were brought to Lone Rock. The businesses grew up around the depot, and they were like the Cheese Warehouse, Kirkpatrick's in Richland Center, brought all kinds of cheese down to be shipped. There was a pickle factory, a broom factory, and a hatchery. Now the river didn't bring many settlers, but the railroad did, and most of these were from the east, and especially New York. We had very few immigrants, but I remember as a child, there were all these people that lived around me whose names were Anderson, Peterson, Olson, Gilbertson, you name it. And these old Norwegian ladies liked to gossip a little. But when the children were around, they would speak Norwegian. And we could always tell how bad it was because there was one exclamation, I guess you would say, that they used, and we could tell by the inflection that they placed on it. If what they were gossiping about wasn't so bad, they would say, oofda. Well, if it was a little worse, it was like, oofda. And when it was really bad, it was oofda, feeda, doo. And we children knew what that meant, but they made wonderful cookies and donuts, so we enjoyed them. When Lone Rock was laid out, there was only one log building there, and that was a blacksmith. I'm getting a little ahead. In 1856, several buildings were erected. There were homes, and then stores that were necessary for the residents. The grocery store, general store, barber shop, saloon, and so forth. In 1857, the post office was instituted. And at that time, not only those other businesses, but we also had 4 hotels because there were a lot of people from the train and just travelers that are traveling through. And the hotels were the Union House, the American House, Haskell House, and the Dickerson House. The Dickerson House was a brick hotel that was on Main Street for years. Haskell House was brought from Richland City, and Richland City was a town that had begun building on the banks of the river below Gotham. Now, the banks started to erode away, and so they had to move the buildings. And some of those were floated down the river to Lone Rock. Over the years, we had 15 doctors, 7 pharmacies, 5 dentists, and in 1933, we had a hospital in the north end of the hotel. That was the Dickerson House. And one of those doctors was so very dear to all of us, and her name was Dr. Bertha Reynolds. She came from Kansas, and her family was made up of male doctors, and they really tried to discourage her from becoming a doctor. They thought a nurse was a better thing to do. Her brother was a doctor in Lone Rock, and she and her mother came to visit him, and she decided to stay and take up practice with him. He died, and then she took over his practice and was here for over 50 years. She probably delivered most of the babies in, a 10-mile radius or so. Really, nothing ever stopped her. The river had flooded, and she needed to get to Clyde. And she heard that there was a young barnstorming pilot by the name of Charles Lindbergh out at the airport. So she hitched a ride with him, and he took her to Clyde to deliver a baby, and then he took her on to Plain to take care of those patients. Dr. Bertha was one of the first women to graduate from medical school. In 1861, the Civil War started, and Henry Dillon responded to the president's call for recruits, and the 6th Wisconsin Battery Light Artillery was formed. He turned his tailor shop into a recruiting center, and they had 157 officers and recruits from this area, and one of them was Jenkin Lloyd Jones. And he did write a book about his experiences. I don't remember the name of it, but we have a copy in our history room. Later, they added 85 men as replacements for a total of 242 men. They fought on the Western Front. Now, there's a story that Dillon's horse was shot right out from under him, but of course, he wasn't injured, so he went right on. And the battery was so aggressive that they wore out their cannon. They just picked up one that the Southern soldiers had left behind and kept right on. They were mustered in Racine in 1861 and out at Camp Randall in Madison in 1865. And there are some newspaper articles and other things over there on the table that you may enjoy looking at. This monument was put in what we call Battery Park along Highway 130 in Lone Rock in 1884. And the names of the men are all on it, and there are 4 sides. And then the names of some of their most, some of their worst battles that they fought in are around the base. You can see it from the highway. It's really quite interesting. The tailor shop then was later moved to Battery Park, and the Historical Society keeps things in there. We have a whole variety of Civil War history because the Dillons left some of that information to us, and we gathered some from other places too. We do have Captain Dillon's uniform, just the jacket. He made it himself because, of course, he was a tailor, and he made it to the specifications that were required. We also have his sword and his belt buckle. The GAR met at Battery Park for years, and these were veterans of the Civil War. Now, the period between the Civil War and the Depression, the village really grew. In fact, we were a little bigger than Spring Green at that time, if you can imagine. The village has always been very interested in education, and we have a timeline up here showing the schools. The first school was in 1856, and it was above one of the doctor's pharmacies, and they only had school for 5 months. In 1857, the first school building was built, and it was a one-room, ungraded school, and it's still in the village. It's behind the car wash, right off Main Street. In 1875, a high school was started, and it was in what was called the White School. And there was another building too, but that one burned. So in 1902, the red brick building on Dr. Bertha Reynolds Street was built, and it housed grades 1 through 12. Many of us have such good memories of spending 12 years there and all the things that we did. The extracurricular activities and sports and forensics and prom and all those things. In 1956, the elementary school was built, and that was because they were very overcrowded in the brick building, and we could no longer use the basement classrooms. The elementary school was grades 1 through 8. In 1960, Lone Rock joined the River Valley School District, and in 1962, the high school closed. The elementary school was enlarged to accommodate the rural students and the kindergarten. So it was kindergarten through 5th grade. 2015, it was decided that the elementary enrollment was really declining. And so there was a study done, of course, and they ended up closing the outlying schools and bring all the elementary children to Spring Green. Lone Rock was the first to be closed, and the last day of school was June 6, 2017. That brought to an end 161 years of education in Lone Rock, when we were always very proud of our school and all our sports and so forth. Between the Civil War and World War I, the village really flourished, and they catered to the railroad, to travelers, and to the farmers. So there were 4 hotels, 3 grocery stores, 2 drugstores, 2 banks, 3 saloons. I think we've always had 3 saloons. A hardware store, 3 churches. Later there were 4 car dealers, 6 equipment farm equipment dealers. I think we can turn. Oh. Can't follow my own writing here. On Wednesday and Saturday nights, the store stayed open a little later, and there were band concerts in the summer and movies, and there was bank night, so it brought a lot of people into town. In 1935, the community building was built. It replaced Dewey Hall, and Dewey Hall was the upper part of the keg. The what? Keg?
Kettle. King kettle?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I need help. Keg and kettle. And that burned off, and that was where they had always had all of their graduations, proms, plays, and so forth. The community building was a WPA project, or a work project administration is the name of it. And it was designed to employ local people, local workers during the Depression. The Lone Rock School needed a facility for school functions, and so they rented it from 1935 to 1962. Did you, is the uranium tunnel on the, well, just a little sideline, a little unusual thing to have was a uranium tunnel, and that was in the 50s. And a gentleman from, well, I don't think he was from Clyde, a little farther over, but he had gone to Arizona, and he came back with all these bags of low-grade uranium. And he lined chairs and couches and benches with these bags. And people came from all over the United States to sit on a bag of uranium because it would cure your cancer and whatever else you had. Well, the Department of Health caught up with them. And so it was closed because they were practicing medicine without a license. All right, we had 4 newspapers in Lone Rock over the years, and the last one was the Lone Rock Journal. We had telephone service in 1892. I added this, so don't. We had electricity in 1913, and the lights were on from dusk until midnight. So you better get home before midnight. The Tri-County Airport was a national weather service, and many of those families lived in town. And on January 30th, 1951, Ben Sokol, who was on duty, went out to check the weather. And it was, he couldn't believe it. It was 53 below zero. And we made the national news. It was also used as a training field for pilots from Truex Field during World War II. Our firemen are 150 years old. We celebrated them July 4th, 2019, and of course, first they were volunteers and had a bucket brigade, and they placed the bell on the depot because it was open 24 hours. And in 1894, they got their first truck and they paid $800 for it. Now, there were several disasters that really influenced the village. There were several fires. In 1892, the Union Block, it was called that, was 3 stores burned. They rebuilt them, and in 1901, a burglar was in Fuller and Foster's store, and he set off a charge to crack the safe, and instead it set those same 3 buildings on fire. On May 24th, 1918, we were struck by a massive cyclone, and it came from the southwest and went northeast for a 300-foot path of destruction. There were 18 buildings destroyed in the village and about that many more damaged. 9 railroad cars were tipped over, 3 persons were killed, the editor of the newspaper and 2 children. It swept across the prairie to Plain, killing 1 child and killing all kinds of cattle and destroying farm buildings. And they called Richland Center and Spring Green for doctors, and they could not understand why we needed doctors. They had no indication that anything had happened. Many of them rebuilt, but others moved away. And all of these events and others, such as school closings, had an impact on the village. Few businesses now employ very many people, and we're basically a bedroom community. I know I'm running over a little, but I'm almost done. This is just scratching the surface. I just picked out things that I thought were like milestones in the village. We have so much history in our history room. We have 1 little room in the library. It is crammed with information. And people are welcome to use it for research if they would like. They must have a historical member with them, but you're more than welcome to use it. Our Economic Development Committee has been very active. We have a couple of new businesses started, and others have reopened. The latest improvements are a splash pad for the kids, the Veterans Memorial, and the coldest spot in the nation, the Lone Rock sign, has been refurbished. We're working to make the village more appealing to attract businesses as well as residents. We're working on Main Street and housing in anticipation of the new bridges. And I'd like to close with a poem that was in our bicentennial book. One of the people that was on that committee wrote this: "From the coldest spot in the nation. This book was created to those who lived here. This book is dedicated. The pictures inside are begged, borrowed, or on loan. So look at the faces, one may be your own. We hope you enjoyed the tales of this hardy old stock who founded and lived in the village of Lone Rock." Thank you.